When I was 57, my only son sold my house right out from under me, packed up his wife, and moved 2 states away. They left me exactly $150 and a note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "You will figure it out." 15 years later, my grandson Googled my name for a college assignment and called me in tears. Within 12 hours, I had 200 missed calls from the son who threw me away like trash. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. The screen of my smartphone illuminated the pitch-black darkness of my private study, casting a harsh, pale glow over the polished mahogany desk. It was buzzing again, a relentless, frantic vibration that threatened to rattle the phone right off the edge. I sat back in my leather chair, perfectly still, watching the notifications pile up. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not stopped since noon. I picked up the device, feeling the cold metal against my calloused hands. Hands that had worked tirelessly for decades to build a life that my own flesh and blood had once stolen from me. I swiped the screen and answered, bringing the receiver to my ear without uttering a single word. Heavy, erratic breathing echoed through the speaker. Then a voice cracked the silence. It was young, trembling, and choked with tears. "Grandpa." The word hit me like a physical blow. It was Colton. The last time I saw my grandson, he was just a 7-year-old boy playing in the dirt of my backyard, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal his parents were orchestrating inside the house. I remained silent, letting the heavy reality of 15 years of absence settle between us. "Grandpa, please do not hang up," Colton pleaded, his voice breaking. "I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know anything. I was doing a research paper for my university business class today. My professor assigned us to profile top philanthropists in the biotech industry. I typed your name into Google just to see if maybe somehow you were still alive. The Forbes magazine article came up. The biotech billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that really you?" I closed my eyes, letting out a slow, measured breath. The silence of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt entirely isolated from the chaos erupting on the other end of the line. "Yes, Colton," I finally said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of a 72-year-old man who had survived absolute ruin. "It is me." A sob ripped from the young man's throat. Colton was 22 now, but in that moment, he sounded like a lost child. "They told me you abandoned us," he cried, his words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate panic. "Mom and Dad told me you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and left us with nothing. But the article said you started your company from scratch 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Colton," I replied calmly. "They made a choice to take everything I had, and they made a choice to lie to you about it. I built my life back from the ashes they left me in. I did not run away. I survived them." I could hear Colton crying, the devastating realization of his parents' true nature crashing down on him. But before he could ask another question, the audio on his end muffled violently. There was a sudden chaotic scuffle. I heard a door slam open, followed by a sharp gasp from Colton. "Give me that phone." A harsh, demanding voice barked in the background. A brief struggle ensued, the sound of plastic scraping against skin. And then the line went dead for a fraction of a second, before a new voice spoke into the receiver. It was Desmond, my son. The man who had looked me in the eye 15 years ago, smiled, and quietly sold the roof over my head. "Dad," Desmond's voice was frantic, breathless, but beneath the manufactured panic, I could hear the unmistakable, sickening tone of absolute greed. "Dad, is that really you?" "Oh my God. We have been looking for you everywhere. For 15 years we have been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone tightened, but my heart rate did not spike. I felt no fear, no sudden rush of paternal love, only a cold, calculated clarity. The son, who had discarded me like a broken tool, was suddenly frantic to reconnect. Not because he missed his father, but because he had just discovered his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something," Desmond begged, his voice dripping with a sickly, sweet desperation. "My company is in trouble. We are facing a massive crisis, and when Colton showed us the article, I could not believe it. You have to tell me where you are. We are family, Dad. You have to save us." I listened to his frantic breathing, visualizing the sheer panic and avarice twisting his features. He was waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the forgiving, naive father he had left behind 15 years ago, to rush in and rescue him. But that man was dead. They had killed him the day they handed me a crumpled $150. I pulled the phone away from my ear, hovered my thumb over the glowing red icon, and tapped it. The call disconnected with a sharp, definitive click. I dropped the phone back onto the mahogany desk, plunging the room back into total, undisturbed silence. The first move was his. The next one would be mine. Imagine returning home from your wife's funeral, only to find the locks changed, your belongings gone, and a crumpled $150 on the porch, with a note from your only son reading, "You will figure it out." I did figure it out. For 15 years they thought I had crawled into a hole to wither away. But yesterday, my 22-year-old grandson typed my name into a search engine for a college paper and uncovered a billion-dollar secret. Within 12 hours, my phone was blown up with 200 missed calls from the very people who threw me away like garbage. Before I tell you how I handled the ultimate family betrayal, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like, and subscribe if you believe karma never misses an address. The screen of my smartphone illuminated the pitch-black darkness of my private study, casting a harsh, pale glow over the polished mahogany desk. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline glittered like scattered diamonds, a stark contrast to the dark memories flooding my mind. My phone was buzzing again, a relentless, frantic vibration that threatened to rattle the device right off the edge of the table. I sat back in my leather chair, perfectly still, watching the notifications pile up. 200 missed calls, in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not stopped since noon. I picked up the phone, feeling the cold metal against my calloused hands, hands that had worked tirelessly, for decades, to build a life my own flesh and blood had once stolen from me. I swiped the screen and answered, bringing the receiver to my ear without uttering a single word. Heavy, erratic breathing echoed through the speaker. Then a voice cracked the silence. It was young, trembling, and choked with tears. "Grandpa." The word hit me like a physical blow. It was Colton. The last time I saw my grandson, he was just a 7-year-old boy, playing in the dirt of my backyard, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal his parents were orchestrating inside the house. I remained silent, letting the heavy reality of 15 years of absence settle between us. "Grandpa, please do not hang up," Colton pleaded, his voice breaking into a sob. "I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know anything. I was doing a research paper for my university business class today. My professor assigned us to profile top philanthropists in the biotech industry. I typed your name into the search bar just to see if maybe somehow you were still alive. The Forbes magazine article came up. The biotech billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that really you?" I closed my eyes, letting out a slow, measured breath. The silence of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt entirely isolated from the chaos erupting on the other end of the line. "Yes, Colton," I finally said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of a 72-year-old man who had survived absolute ruin. "It is me." A harsh sob ripped from the young man's throat. Colton was 22 now, but in that moment, he sounded like a lost, devastated child. "They told me you abandoned us," he cried, his words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate panic. "Mom and Dad told me you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and left us with absolutely nothing. But the article said you started your company from scratch 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Colton," I replied calmly. "They made a choice to take everything I had, and they made a choice to lie to you about it. I built my life back from the ashes they left me in. I did not run away. I survived them." I could hear Colton crying, the devastating realization of his parents' true nature crashing down on him. But before he could ask another question, the audio on his end muffled violently. There was a sudden chaotic scuffle. I heard a door slam open, followed by a sharp gasp from Colton. "Give me that phone!" A harsh, demanding voice barked in the background. I could hear Sabrina shouting in the distance, telling him to put it on speaker. A brief struggle ensued, the sound of plastic scraping against skin, and then the line went dead for a fraction of a second, before a new voice spoke into the receiver. It was Desmond. The man who had looked me in the eye 15 years ago, smiled, and quietly sold the roof over my head. "Dad." Desmond's voice was frantic, breathless, but beneath the manufactured panic, I could hear the unmistakable, sickening tone of absolute greed. "Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we have been looking for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone tightened, but my heart rate did not spike. I felt no fear, no sudden rush of paternal love, only a cold, calculated clarity. The son, who had discarded me like a broken tool, was suddenly frantic to reconnect. Not because he missed his father, but because he had just discovered his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something," Desmond begged, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet desperation. "My company is in trouble. We are facing a massive financial crisis. And when Colton showed us the article, I could not believe it. You have to tell me where you are. We are family. Dad, you have to save us." I listened to his frantic breathing, visualizing the sheer panic and avarice twisting his features. He was waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the forgiving, naive father he had left behind 15 years ago to rush in and rescue him. He actually believed that time and blood would erase the memory of standing in an empty driveway holding a pathetic wad of cash while the moving truck drove away. But that man was dead. They had killed him the day they handed me a crumpled $150 and told me to figure it out. Now he wanted me to save his failing real estate business. He wanted the billionaire philanthropist, not the father. I pulled the phone away from my ear, hovered my thumb over the glowing red icon, and tapped it. The call disconnected with a sharp, definitive click. I dropped the phone back onto the mahogany desk, plunging the room back into total, undisturbed silence. The first move was his. The next one would be mine. The heavy mahogany doors of my private boardroom clicked shut, sealing us inside. Desmond did not waste time with pleasantries or fake apologies. He walked straight to the long glass table and tossed a thick, glossy folder across its surface. It slid and stopped exactly in front of me. I looked at the folder, then up at the man who used to be my son. He was wearing a tailored suit that tried to mask the desperate sweat beating on his forehead. He leaned over the table, planting his hands flat on the glass, and demanded a $2 million loan to save his failing real estate development firm. He spoke rapidly, throwing around terms like liquidity crisis and temporary market downturns, trying to sound like a savvy businessman negotiating a deal. But I could see the sheer panic in his eyes. He was drowning, and he expected me to be his life raft. I sat back in my chair, keeping my hands perfectly still on my lap, and let him talk. I did not interrupt. I just watched the breathtaking audacity unfold in real time. Then Sabrina chimed in. She was sitting next to him wearing an expensive silk dress, paid for by someone else's money, crossing her legs with a practiced elegance that made my stomach turn. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with a sickly rehearsed sweetness that quickly turned into a sharp accusation. She looked me right in the eye and said that, while a loan for the business was the priority, we also needed to discuss Colton. She had the nerve to tell me that growing up without a grandfather had been incredibly hard on my grandson. She claimed my sudden disappearance 15 years ago had left a deep psychological void in Colton's life. According to her twisted narrative, I was the one who had abandoned them. She sat there in my womb and demanded that I immediately set up a massive trust fund for Colton to compensate for my absence during his childhood. The absolute shamelessness of it all hung heavy in the air. These were the two people who had tricked me into signing over my power of attorney, while I was completely numb with grief over my late wife. These were the people who liquidated my home, packed up their belongings, and fled across state lines. They had left me with a single crumpled $100 bill and a $50, along with a note telling me to figure it out. Now they were trying to rewrite history, casting themselves as the abandoned victims of a negligent father. I did not scream. I did not throw the folder back in their faces. The anger inside me was not a fiery explosion. It was a cold and calculating glacier. I looked at the $2 million proposal, then at Sabrina, and then at Desmond. I let the silence stretch out for 10, maybe 15 seconds. I furrowed my brow slightly and let out a soft sigh, deliberately acting as though I was hesitating. I made it look like I was a tired, guilty old man, genuinely wrestling with the weight of my past mistakes and considering their ridiculous demands. That hesitation was a test, and Desmond failed it instantly. Patience had never been his strong suit. Suit and desperation had stripped away whatever thin veneer of respect he had left. He slammed his fist down on the glass table. The sharp, cracking sound echoed loudly through the room. His face flushed a dark, angry red, and the facade of the desperate but respectful businessman completely shattered. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice rising to an ugly and entitled shout. He told me to stop playing games. He yelled that I was 72 years old and had absolutely no use for billions of dollars. He said, I was an old man sitting alone in a penthouse while my real family was struggling to survive. He leaned so close I could see the frantic pulse beating in his neck and spat out the words that sealed his fate forever. He told me that I owed them this money. He said, I owed them for disappearing all those years ago and leaving them to fend for themselves. That was the moment, the final drop of water that caused the glass to overflow. He actually believed his own lies. He believed that because I had remained silent for a decade and a half, I was weak. He thought my quiet observation was submission. I looked at his red, angry face, and I did not see my son anymore. I saw a parasite that had finally run out of hosts. I kept my expression entirely blank, locking away the lethal trap I was about to spring. The tension in the private boardroom was thick enough to choke on. Desmond was still leaning over the massive glass table, his face flushed with a toxic mix of entitlement and panic, waiting for me to simply hand over $2 million to save his sinking business. Before I could deliver my response, the heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom flew open with a violent crash. They hit the wall so hard, the sound echoed like a gunshot through the sprawling room. There, standing in the doorway, chest heaving and eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy, was Colton. He looked like he had run all the way from his university campus. His heavy backpack slipped off his shoulder and hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. He did not even look at me. His tear-filled eyes locked entirely on his parents. "Colton, what are you doing here?" Desmond snapped. His voice dropped an octave, trying to quickly mask his raw, pathetic desperation with parental authority. Sabrina immediately stood up, smoothing down her expensive silk dress. Her fake smile trembled as she reached a hand out toward him. Colton ignored her outstretched hand. He stepped further into the room, his breathing ragged. "You love me," he said, his voice shaking, but growing louder with every single word. "My entire life, you told me he abandoned us. You told me he ran away with some mistress and drained our family bank accounts." Sabrina's face drained of color. She glanced at me nervously, then back at her son. "Sweetheart, please, we can talk about this at home. This is not the time or the place for this conversation. Your father and I are trying to conduct very important business." "Business?" Colton scoffed, a bitter, heartbroken laugh escaping his lips. "You are here begging him for money. The man you told me was a selfish coward. The man you said left us to starve. I read the articles on my way over here. I saw the dates. He lost everything. The exact same month we moved into that massive house in the suburbs. You stole from him. You stole everything he had." The air in the room was instantly sucked out. Desmond's face contorted into something ugly and terrifying. His carefully constructed facade of the struggling but respectable real estate developer completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, vicious animal. "Shut your mouth," Desmond roared. He closed the distance between him and his son in 2 long strides and raised his hand. The slap was deafening. The sharp, violent, cracking sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed off the high ceiling of the boardroom. Colton stumbled backward, his hand flying to his rapidly reining cheek, his eyes wide with absolute shock and betrayal. Sabrina gasped, but she did not move a single inch to comfort her son. She just stood there, paralyzed by the collapse of her own lies. I did not think. I just moved. At 72 years old, you would assume my reflexes were slow, but the protective instinct of a grandfather is entirely immune to age. Before Desmond could raise his hand to strike his son a second time, I wedged myself firmly between them. I shoved Desmond back with a physical force that surprised both of us, making him stumble against the sharp edge of the glass table. "Do not ever lay a hand on him again," I warned, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. The room fell dead silent. Desmond looked at me, rubbing his chest where I had shoved him. I was breathing heavily, his eyes darting wildly. "You have no right to interfere," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He is my son. You do not get to walk back into our lives after 15 years and dictate how I discipline my own child." I stood my ground, keeping Colton safely tucked behind my shoulder. I could feel the young man tremble, but he did not step away from me. I stared at the man I had raised. In that precise moment, the last lingering shred of parental endurance completely evaporated from my soul. The hesitant, guilty old man they thought they were manipulating was entirely gone. In his place stood a man who had survived absolute ruin and built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. I looked at Desmond, not with anger, but with a chilling, ruthless clarity. The time for observation was over. It was time to spring the trap. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket, deliberately breaking the tension with a terrifying, icy calmness. I took a slow breath, and looked from Desmond's furious face to Sabrina's pale, greedy eyes. "You are absolutely right," I said, letting the words hang heavily in the air. "I owe you. I owe you both exactly what you deserve for the past 15 years. Desmond slowly lowered his hand. His breathing calmed as the word "owe" triggered the parasitic greed inside his brain. His anger was instantly overridden by his desperate need for my wealth. I walked back to my leather chair, perfectly composed, and looked at them. "Tomorrow night, my fund is hosting our annual charity gala downtown," I said smoothly, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a man holding all the cards. "Every major investor, media outlet, and industry leader will be in attendance. It is the biggest event of the year for my company. I want you both there. Dress well. Be on time. Colton will be attending as my personal guest." Desmond exchanged a rapid, calculating look with Sabrina. He swallowed hard, his previous rage completely melting away into a desperate, hungry anticipation. "And the loan?" Desmond asked, his voice shaking with renewed hope. "The $2 million. I met his greedy, pathetic gaze and gave him a slow, measured nod. "Tomorrow night, I will take the stage," I promised, "and in front of everyone, I will officially announce my decision regarding my successor and the future of my entire fortune. Be there, and you will get exactly what is coming to you." Desmond's eyes lit up with a blinding, toxic ambition. A smug, victorious smile crept onto Sabrina's face. They actually believed they had won. They had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker, completely unaware that they were walking straight into their own execution. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, swallowing the frantic, desperate energy my son had brought into the room. I was alone again. The silence in the penthouse boardroom returned thick and absolute, a stark contrast to the explosive family drama that had just played out. I did not collapse into my leather chair. I did not rub my temples or shed a single tear over the broken relationship with my son. That grief had been buried 15 years ago. Now there was only the cold mechanical precision of a man who had just invited a parasite to a feast. I reached for the sleek intercom on my desk and pressed the button. "Send Callum in," I said. My voice was steady, stripped of any residual emotion. Within 60 seconds, the doors opened again. Callum, my chief legal counsel and head of corporate intelligence, walked into the room. I was a man who moved with quiet efficiency, his face a perfect mask of professional detachment. He carried a thick leather briefcase, which he placed gently onto the glass table, right where Desmond had slammed his fist moments before. "You asked me to dig into his company," Callum said, clicking the briefcase open. "I did not just dig, Everett. I brought out the heavy machinery." He pulled out a massive stack of confidential financial records, bank statements, and court filings, spreading them out across the table. I looked at the sea of paperwork. Desmond thought he could walk into my office, throw around some industry buzzwords, and blind me with a fabricated story about a temporary liquidity crisis. He and his wife actually believed the man who had built a global biotechnology empire from absolute scratch would simply hand over $2 million without running a forensic background check. Callum tapped a manicured finger against a spreadsheet highlighted in bright red ink. "Your son is not just experiencing a market downturn," Callum stated, his tone completely flat. "He is broke. In fact, broke would be a massive improvement over his current situation. Desmond is drowning in catastrophic criminal debt." I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted documents. "For the past 3 years," Callum continued, "Desmond has been running his real estate development firm like a personal piggy bank. He has been systematically siphoning funds from his ongoing residential projects to fund a lavish lifestyle. Designer clothes, luxury cars, expensive vacations. all paid for by money that did not belong to him. He created a web of fake vendor invoices to cover his tracks, but he got sloppy. But that is not the worst part, Callum said, pulling a secondary file from his briefcase. This file had a federal seal printed near the top margin. 2 months ago, a group of private investors caught on to the discrepancies in his quarterly reports. They hired a forensic accounting firm. The auditors discovered a gaping black hole in his corporate accounts. Desmond has embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He is currently under an active covert investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The puzzle pieces snap together with crystal clarity. The frantic phone calls, the sudden desperate need to reconnect after 15 years of silence, the aggressive demand for exactly $2 million. Desmond did not want my money to invest in new properties. He needed a massive, immediate injection of untraceable cash to quietly plug the hole in his accounts before the federal agents kicked his front door off the hinges. He was terrified, cornered, and looking for a scapegoat. He thought he could use the father he had thrown away as a human shield against a federal indictment. I let out a low, humorless laugh. It was a pathetic, brilliant kind of arrogance. He had thrown me out onto the street with $150, assuming I would simply roll over and die. Now, facing decades in a federal penitentiary, he expected me to blindly hand over $2 million to save him from his own greed. He really thought I was still that same naive, grieving old man from 15 years ago. Callum gathered the documents, stacking them neatly back into his briefcase. He looked at me, his expression grave. "We have undeniable proof of his financial crimes, Everett," Callum said quietly. "The wire transfers, the fake shell companies, the forged signatures. It is all here. Should I call the authorities right now? We can hand this entire portfolio over to the federal investigators and have him arrested before he even makes it back to his house." I stood up from my chair and walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was lighting up, a sprawling grid of gold and silver, stretching out toward the horizon. I looked down at the streets, thinking about the magnificent charity gala that would take place tomorrow night. I thought about Desmond rushing home to tell his wife that they had successfully manipulated the old man, that their salvation was guaranteed. I wanted him to savor that feeling. I wanted him to taste victory. I wanted him to sleep soundly tonight, dreaming of the billions he was about to inherit. I turned back to Callum and shook my head, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving ice. "No," I replied smoothly. "Do not call the police. Let him put on his expensive suit. Let him walk the red carpet. Let him step up onto the podium of glory and feel the heavy golden crown of victory resting on his head. Because a fall from the very bottom step is easily forgotten, Callum. I want him to fall from the very top. Only when he believes he has won everything will we kick him off the edge." The bell above the door of the small corner cafe chimed softly, cutting through the low hum of the espresso machine. I sat in a booth near the back, nursing a black coffee, watching the entrance. Colton walked in. He looked completely drained. The heavy bags under his eyes and his slumped shoulders told the story of a young man whose entire reality was fracturing, piece by piece. He spotted me and navigated through the narrow maze of wooden tables. He slid into the booth across from me, keeping his gaze fixed on the scarred wooden tabletop. I did not offer him a warm smile or a comforting pat on the shoulder. This was not a family reunion. This was an intervention. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I placed it squarely in the center of the table. The metal clinked against the wood, drawing his eyes downward. I told him that inside that small drive was the absolute truth about the people who raised him. I explained that his father was not suffering from a simple market downturn. I laid out the facts plainly. Desmond had embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He had falsified documents, created fake vendor accounts, and funneled stolen money to maintain a lifestyle of pure luxury. I told Colton that his parents were not looking for a family reconciliation. They were looking for a human shield to place between themselves and a federal indictment. Colton stared at the silver drive as if it were a venomous snake. His breathing grew shallow. He asked me how they could do something so reckless, how they could lie so easily to everyone. I looked at my grandson and told him that lying was the easiest thing his parents ever did. I asked him to picture a 57-year-old man coming back from the cemetery. I had just buried my wife, his grandmother. The house was supposed to be a place of mourning and comfort. Instead, I walked up to the front porch and found the door locked. My key did not turn. I looked through the front window and saw that the living room was completely empty. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every memory had been stripped bare. I kept my voice incredibly steady as I described the sheer breathless panic of that afternoon. I told him about the single envelope waiting on the doormat. Inside was exactly $150 in crumpled bills and a handwritten note from his father. The note just said to figure it out. They had exploited my absolute grief. They had tricked me into signing over my assets, while my mind was clouded with sorrow and heavy medication. They took my home, my life savings, and my only grandson, and they drove away across state lines without ever looking back. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the small booth. Colton covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook violently as he tried to muffle his sobs. The crushing weight of the truth was breaking him down entirely. The he had looked up to, the life of privilege he had enjoyed. It was all built on the bones of an old man they had left for dead. He whispered that they were monsters. He kept repeating it, his voice cracking with absolute disgust and heartbreak. I did not disagree with him. I let him cry. I let the pain of the betrayal burn away the last remaining illusions he held about his family. It was a brutal thing to watch a young man lose his parents while they were still alive. But a surgeon does not hesitate to cut away infected tissue. The infection simply had to be removed. I waited until his breathing slowed, and he finally wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and pushed the silver flash drive a few inches closer to him. I told him that tomorrow night, the entire city would be watching the charity gala. I told him that his parents would be sitting in the front row, wearing clothes bought with my stolen credit line, waiting to be crowned the heirs to my empire. Then I gave him a mission. I told Colton that, right before I took the stage, he needed to take that flash drive and walk toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom. I instructed him to look for a tall man, wearing a dark gray suit, standing near the service doors. I told him to hand the drive directly to that man. Colton looked up at me, his eyes wide and red. He asked me who the man in the gray suit was. I did not answer his question. I simply told him that for his entire life, his parents had made his choices for him. They had chosen what he believed, who he trusted, and what kind of life he lived. But tomorrow night, the choice belonged entirely to him. I told my grandson that he had to choose a side. He could take the drive, walk away, and stand with the people who had built their lives on lies and theft. Or he could hand over the drive and stand with the truth. I picked up my coffee, took a final sip, and stood up from the booth. I looked down at the young man, wrestling with the hardest decision of his life. Colton reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers closing tightly around the cold metal of the flash drive. He looked up at me and gave a single, definitive nod. The battle lines were drawn. The grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was a sea of glittering crystal and relentless flashing lights. It was the night of my foundation's annual charity gala, the absolute pinnacle of the city's corporate and social calendar. Down below, on the sprawling red carpet that poured into the main hall, a circus of media and high society was already in full swing. The bright flashes from the photographers popped like tiny bursts of lightning, illuminating the absolute peak of my son's arrogance. Desmond and Sabrina were standing right in the center of the media frenzy, basking in the glow of a spotlight they had done nothing to earn. They looked like royalty, draped in the kind of staggering luxury that could only be bought with stolen money. Desmond was wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. Sabrina stood beside him in a breathtaking floor-length emerald gown, her neck and wrists dripping with diamonds. I knew exactly how much those outfits cost, because the fraud notifications from my corporate credit accounts had been lighting up my phone all afternoon. They had spared absolutely no expense, treating my name and my credit line as their personal, limitless bank account. They were parading around in the spoils of their impending victory, completely unaware that every single diamond, every single thread of silk was just another nail in their legal coffin. I stood alone on the curved second-floor mezzanine balcony, hidden in the soft shadows, looking down at the spectacle. The acoustics of the grand hall carried their voices up to me with perfect clarity. A local financial reporter shoved a microphone toward Desmond, asking about his sudden appearance in the city and his role in my biotech empire. Desmond flashed a practiced, devastatingly charming smile. He wrapped an arm tightly around Sabrina's waist, pulling her close to present the flawless image of a devoted family man. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with a sickening, carefully manufactured humility. "My father is a brilliant man," Desmond said smoothly, looking out at the sea of reporters. "He has built something truly incredible here, but he is getting older, and the demands of leading a global company are taking their toll on him. I am here to step up. I am here to take over the empire so that he can finally rest. It is my duty, as his son, to carry the torch and to care for him in his final years. He has given so much to the world, and now it is time for his family to give back to him." Sabrina nodded beside him, placing a manicured hand over her heart, playing the role of the supportive, loving daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. I gripped the cold marble railing of the balcony. The sheer, unadulterated poison of his words was almost impressive. He stood there, soaking in the admiration of the press, painting himself as the loyal heir, rushing to the side of his weary father. This was the same man who had left me with $150 and a note telling me to figure it out. This was the man who was currently being hunted by federal agents for embezzling $4 million from his own investors. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, building his pedestal higher and higher, inflating his ego until it consumed the entire room. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted him to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute power. Suddenly, a sharp-eyed journalist from a major business publication looked up and spotted me standing on the mezzanine. The murmur in the massive crowd shifted as dozens of heads tilted upward. The popping of the camera flashes redirected, illuminating my face in the shadows. Desmond followed their gaze, looking up at me. His charming smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of nervous anticipation crossing his eyes, before he quickly recovered and beamed up at me with fake adoration. "Mr. Everett," the journalist called out, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the grand hall. "Your son just spoke about the future of your company. Will you be stepping down tonight? Are you officially handing over power and naming him as your successor?" The entire ballroom went dead silent. Hundreds of eyes, including the greedy, desperate eyes of my son and his wife, were locked entirely on me. They were waiting for the validation they thought they had successfully manipulated out of me. They were waiting for me to publicly surrender my life's work into their thieving hands. I rested my hands on the railing and looked directly down at Desmond. I let the silence stretch out, letting his anticipation reach a fever pitch. I offered a slow, calm smile that gave absolutely nothing away. Tonight is a very special night. I projected my voice clearly, so that every reporter, every investor, and every single guest in the room could hear me. It is a night about legacy, about truth, and about the future. I have made my decision regarding the fate of my company and my fortune, and I promise you tonight, everything will be given to the one who truly deserves it. The reporters erupted into excited chatter, frantically scribbling notes and snapping more photos. Down below, Desmond's eyes lit up with a blinding, euphoric triumph. Sabrina visibly let out a long breath of relief, her fake smile stretching from ear to ear. They heard my words and translated them through the lens of their own staggering narcissism. They truly believed they had won the ultimate prize. They had no idea that the curtain was about to rise on their total destruction. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and I stepped out onto the main stage of the grand ballroom. The sheer intensity of the theatrical spotlights hit me instantly, washing out the sea of faces in the cavernous room and casting a brilliant, blinding glow over the podium. As I walked toward the center of the stage, the low, buzzing symphony of hundreds of overlapping conversations began to fade. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft shuffling of expensive shoes died down completely until a heavy, expectant silence settled over the entire hall. This was the moment the city's elite had been waiting for all evening. I adjusted the microphone, the metallic scrape echoing loudly across the room. I looked down into the audience. Because of the harsh stage lighting, the people in the back were just shadowy silhouettes, but the front row was perfectly illuminated. Standing dead center, practically pressing their knees against the velvet rope that separated the stage from the crowd, were Desmond and Sabrina. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. Desmond had unbuttoned his suit jacket and shifted his weight forward, looking like a runner waiting for the starting pistol. He was staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes, a tight, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He had already raised one hand to his chest, casually adjusting his designer silk tie, physically preparing himself to walk up the steps and accept his coronation. Sabrina stood shoulder-to-shoulder with him, her manicured hands clasped tightly together in front of her emerald gown, looking up at me with an expression of breathless, manufactured devotion. They were so utterly consumed by their own staggering greed that they did not notice the cold, unyielding, completely hollow look in my eyes. I leaned into the microphone, my voice ringing out deep and steady, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. 15 years ago, I began, letting the words hang in the heavy air. 15 years ago, I stood on an empty driveway, with nothing but the clothes on my back. I had no home. I had no family. I had exactly $150 to my name. A soft, captivated murmur rippled through the crowd of investors and journalists. They loved this story. To them, it was the ultimate American underdog narrative. The brilliant founder who rose from the ashes of personal tragedy to build a biotechnology empire. Down in the front row, Desmond's smile widened. He nodded along slowly, playing the part of the proud son, assuming this was just the dramatic prelude to his grand introduction. I built this company on a foundation of absolute survival, I continued, keeping my gaze locked directly on Desmond. I spent the last decade and a half securing the future, developing innovations that change lives, and creating a legacy of staggering wealth. But true legacy is not simply about what you build. It is about what you leave behind, and more importantly, who you leave it to. The tension in the ballroom reached a fever pitch. The flashing of the cameras intensified, a rapid-fire strobe light capturing the historic moment. Desmond took a half step forward, his polished leather shoes pressing against the velvet rope. He was ready. He was waiting for his name. "Tonight," I announced, "the final irrevocable disposition of my entire estate," I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, lethal register. "Effective immediately, 100% of my corporate equity, my voting rights, my real estate holdings, and my personal liquid assets are being permanently transferred into a newly established ironclad legal entity." Desmond's chest puffed out. He looked around at the journalists, ready to absorb their envy. "I am officially launching the $150 trust," I declared loudly. Desmond blinked. His arrogant smile froze in place. A flicker of deep, genuine confusion crossed his eyes. Sabrina's clasped hands slowly lowered to her sides. "This foundation," I continued, projecting my voice over the sudden confused whispering of the crowd, "is dedicated exclusively to the protection and rehabilitation of elderly individuals who have been the victims of severe financial abuse. It will provide absolute legal and financial warfare against the predators who prey on the vulnerable. Specifically, it is designed to hunt down and prosecute family members, the sons and daughters who manipulate, discard, and rob the very parents who gave them life." The ballroom descended into an absolute suffocating silence. The reporters stopped snapping picture. The wealthy elite stared up at the stage in pure shock. I looked down at the front row. The blood had entirely drained from Desmond's face. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. His mouth was slightly open, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sabrina looked like she was going to be physically sick. "Let me be perfectly clear, so that there is absolutely no confusion regarding the future of my empire," I said, driving the final nail into their coffin with surgical precision. "My wealth belongs to the forgotten. It belongs to the betrayed. It will fund a fortress for those left out in the cold. There are no corporate heirs. There will be no generational wealth transfer. Not a single cent of my fortune will ever go to my bloodline." The shockwave that ripped through the ballroom was instantaneous. A collective audible gasp echoed from the crowd. Down in the front row, the fragile, polished facade of the loving sun completely and violently shattered. The realization of what had just happened crashed down on Desmond, snapping his mind in half. The billions of dollars he had already spent in his head evaporated into thin air. The absolute public humiliation broke him. He lunged forward, grabbing the velvet rope with both hands, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He did not care about the cameras. He did not care about the hundreds of powerful people watching him. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing shrilly off the grand walls. He yelled that I was losing my mind. He screamed that I was a senile, crazy old man who did not know what he was doing. His face turned a dark, furious purple as he pointed a shaking finger directly at me, screaming that I had absolutely no right to stand up there and strip away his assets. Desmond was still screaming, his face a furious shade of red, demanding that someone stop me from taking away his assets. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not call for security to drag him away. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black remote. I aimed it at the control booth in the back of the room and pressed a single button. The massive digital screen behind me flickered. The corporate logo of my biotechnology firm completely vanished. In its place, a new image illuminated the grand ballroom. It was a high-defined 30-foot-tall photograph. It did not show a pharmaceutical breakthrough or a blueprint for a new senior care facility. It showed a piece of yellowed, torn paper resting next to a crumpled $100 bill and a single $50 bill. The handwriting on the note was blown up to a massive scale, perfectly legible for every single person in the room to read. It simply said, "You will figure it out." I leaned back into the microphone, my voice perfectly calm and lethal. I told the audience to look closely at the screen. I explained that they were looking at the entire foundation of my billionaire empire. I told them this was the generous inheritance my only son left for me 15 years ago. A wave of confused muttering rolled through the crowd. I did not let them wonder for long. I told the packed ballroom exactly what happened the week I buried my wife. I described the heavy fog of grief that had completely paralyzed me. I explained how Desmond, the man standing in the front row, pretending to be a devoted son, had approached me while I was heavily medicated and numb with sorrow. He handed me a stack of papers, claiming they were just routine hospital bills and life insurance documents that needed my signature. I trusted my son. I signed them without reading a single word. I told the crowd how I came back from a walk a few days later to find the locks on my own front door changed. The house had been quietly sold out from under me. My son and his wife had packed up all their belongings, emptied our joint bank accounts, and fled across state lines. They left me standing on the porch, with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back, that pathetic wad of cash, and a cruel handwritten note. The silence in the grand ballroom shattered. A collective deafening roar of shock and absolute disgust erupted from the hundreds of investors, philanthropists, and journalists. The reporters at the edge of the stage instantly realized they had just stumbled into the greatest corporate scandal of the decade. They turned their heavy cameras away from the podium and aimed them directly down at the front row. A relentless, blinding barrage of camera flashes hit Desmond right in the face. He stumbled backward, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes. His arrogant, polished posture completely collapsed. He looked like a cornered animal, frantically shaking his head and muttering to himself. The wealthy elites and powerful industry leaders, who had just been shaking his hand and toasting to his future, suddenly stepped away from him. They backed up, leaving a wide, empty circle around Desmond and his wife, treating them like they were carrying a highly contagious disease. Desmond tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but the crowd was shouting over him. The public humiliation was absolute and crushing. The glorious coronation he had been dreaming about all night had transformed into a brutal televised execution. Every lie he had told the media earlier that evening was now choking him. Sabrina watched their entire future turn to ash in a matter of seconds. The realization that they were not getting a single cent of the billion-dollar fortune hit her, followed immediately by the terror of public destruction. Her perfectly crafted image of the loving daughter-in-law evaporated. Pure, unhinged panic took over her body. She lunged forward with a sudden, violent energy. She ripped a heavy microphone right out of the hands of a stunned financial reporter standing near the velvet rope. She gripped it with both hands, her knuckles turning white, and screamed into the device. Her voice echoed shrilly over the grand speakers, bouncing off the high ceilings. She yelled that I was a liar. She frantically pointed her finger at the stage, her breathing heavy and erratic. She screamed to the crowd that they were listening to a crazy, senile old man who was making up stories for attention. She desperately tried to spin a new narrative on the spot, shouting that I was the one who had abandoned them. She claimed that I had drained the family accounts and run away with a mistress, leaving her and Desmond to suffer in poverty. She begged the journalists to stop taking pictures, pleading with the investors not to believe a single word I had said. She was completely hysterical, spiraling into a web of pathetic, fabricated lies. She opened her mouth to scream another accusation, to paint herself as the ultimate victim. But before she could utter another sound, a new voice cut cleanly through the chaos. It was young, shaking with raw emotion, and amplified by the ballroom sound system. All the camera flashes abruptly stopped. Every single head in the grand hall, including Sabrina and Desmond, turned away from the stage and looked straight toward the heavy service doors at the back of the room. The shrill, frantic echoes of Sabrina, screaming her fabricated lies into the microphone, were suddenly cut short. The heavy wooden service doors at the very back of the grand ballroom slammed open with a resounding boom that vibrated through the floorboards. Every single camera flash stopped. Hundreds of powerful investors and aggressive journalists turned their heads in unison. Walking down the long center aisle, perfectly illuminated by the crystal chandeliers overhead, was Colton. My 22-year-old grandson did not look like the terrified college student who had sat across from me in that small corner cafe just 24 hours ago. His shoulders were pulled back. His jaw was clenched tight. He walked with a heavy, deliberate purpose, straight toward the brightly lit stage. Sabrina froze. She stood near the velvet rope holding the stolen microphone, her face pale and shining with nervous sweat. She stared at her son as if she had seen a ghost. Desmond, who was still reeling from the devastating blow of his public exposure, turned around and locked eyes with Colton. Desmond demanded to know what he was doing here. He ordered Colton to get out of the room, to go back to the hotel, and stay out of adult business. He was trying to assert his parental authority, trying to salvage the last tiny fraction of his crumbling empire. But his words fell on completely deaf ears. Colton did not stop walking. He did not look at his father. His eyes were locked entirely on his mother. Colton reached the edge of the stage. He stepped right over the velvet rope, completely ignoring the security guards, who were too stunned by the unfolding drama to intervene. He walked right up to Sabrina. She tried to force a shaky motherly smile. She reached out a trembling hand and told him to tell these people that the old man was lying. She begged him to back up her story, to tell the press how much they had suffered. Colton looked down at her. He reached out and grabbed the microphone right out of her sweating hands. He held it up to his mouth, and his voice echoed across the massive silent ballroom. He looked his mother dead in the eye and told her to shut her mouth. A collective gasp ripped through the elite audience. Reporters scrambled to turn their cameras back on, capturing every single agonizing second of this family destruction. Sabrina stumbled backward, as if she had been physically struck. Colton turned his back on his mother and faced the sea of journalists. He did not hesitate. He told the absolute, unvarnished truth. He announced his name into the microphone and declared that every had just said was completely true. He told the silent, packed room that for his entire life, his parents had fed him a sickening, poisonous lie. They told him his grandfather was a coward, who drained the family accounts and ran away. Colton paused, his voice shaking with raw emotion, but he did not back down. He pointed a finger directly at Desmond. He told the crowd that his father was a thief and a fraud. He revealed that just yesterday, he had discovered the absolute truth. He told them how his parents had left his grandfather homeless, with exactly $150 to his name. He explained how they fled the state and built their fraudulent luxury lifestyle on the back of an old grieving man. Colton looked at the investors in the front row and told them that his parents did not come to this gala to celebrate a legacy. They came to steal what was left of it, because their own real estate business was entirely bankrupt. They came to use a 72-year-old man as a human shield against their own catastrophic crimes. The ballroom erupted into total absolute chaos. Journalists shouted questions over each other, their voices blending into a deafening roar. Investors pulled out their phones, frantically dialing their financial advisors to pull any backing they had with Desmond. The public execution was absolute and flawless. Sabrina covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically as the reality of prison and poverty crashed down on her. But Desmond did not cry. The last remaining thread of his sanity completely snapped. The son he had manipulated, the boy he had controlled his entire life, had just driven a knife right through his public image, in front of the most powerful people in the city. Pure, unadulterated rage blinded Desmond. He let out a feral, completely unhinged scream that pierced through the noise of the crowd. He lowered his head and charged the stage like a rabid animal. He vaulted over the velvet rope, his eyes fixed entirely on Colton. He raised his fist, preparing to deliver a devastating violent blow to his own son, just to make him stop talking. He wanted to punish the boy for tearing down his empire. He wanted to violently silence the truth. But he completely forgot who else was standing on that stage. I did not wait for security. I did not flinch. Decades of survival had hardened my instincts to solid iron. As Desmond lunged toward Colton, I stepped directly into his path. I planted my feet and drove both of my hands hard into the center of his chest. The sheer momentum of his charge met the immovable force of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Desmond lost his footing. He stumbled violently backward, his arms flailing in the empty air. Before he could regain his balance, the elite security team of the Grand Hotel swarmed the stage. 6 heavily built guards in dark suits descended on him from every direction. They tackled Desmond, grabbing his arms and shoulders, and slammed him face first into the polished hardwood floor. The sickening sound of his impact echoed through the microphone that Colton had dropped on the stage. Desmond thrashed and kicked, screaming profanities into the floorboards as the guards pinned his wrists violently behind his back. The perfect, charming businessman was gone, replaced by a pathetic, restrained criminal completely humiliated in front of the entire world. The absolute destruction of my son was broadcasting live to millions. But the night was not over. The final crushing blow was still waiting in the wings. Through the blinding flashes of the cameras, the frantic crowd parted once again, making way for the ultimate consequence. The heavy thud of Desmond hitting the polished hardwood floor echoed through the silent ballroom. 6 massive security guards had him completely pinned down. His arms were wrenched painfully behind his back, his expensive midnight blue tuxedo wrinkling and tearing under the weight of the men holding him. He was thrashing like a wild animal caught in a snare, his face pressed hard against the stage, gasping for breath. The crowd below was absolutely paralyzed. The wealthy elites, the investors, and the journalists simply stared in stunned silence at the spectacular collapse of a man who had thought he was invincible. From the dark shadows of the backstage wings, a figure emerged. It was Callum, my chief legal counsel. He did not run or rush. He walked with the slow, measured pace of an executioner who knew exactly how much time he had. His face was a mask of perfect, chilling indifference. In his right hand, he carried a thick, heavy manila folder. The bright stage lights illuminated the bold red lettering stamped across the front cover. Callum stepped over the discarded microphone and stopped right in front of where Desmond was pinned to the floor. Desmond craned his neck upward, his face red and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a sudden creeping terror. He looked at Callum, then at the thick file, recognizing the fatal weight of whatever was inside it. Callum did not show a single ounce of pity. He simply let go of the folder. It dropped with a heavy, satisfying slap right next to the sweating face of my son. Several loose documents spilled out onto the hardwood floor, perfectly positioning themselves under the bright stage lights. The journalists in the front row immediately leaned forward, their heavy camera lenses zooming in on the pages. They captured every single detail, including the undeniable federal seal printed at the top of the forensic accounting report. Callum bent down slightly, picking up the microphone that Colton had dropped moments before. He tapped it once to ensure it was still live, the sound booming across the cavernous grand hall. He looked down at my son and spoke with a cold, surgical precision that cut through the remaining tension in the room. He told Desmond that he had walked into my private boardroom just 24 hours ago, aggressively demanding a $2 million loan to save his failing real estate empire. The voice of my lawyer was perfectly steady, echoing over the giant speakers. He told the entire room that the desperate story of a temporary market downturn was a complete fabrication. He pointed down at the scattered documents and announced that the forensic audit inside that folder proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Desmond had embezzled $4 million from his own private investors. The collective gasp from the audience was deafening. The investors who had been shaking hands with Desmond just an hour ago physically recoiled in disgust. A few of them immediately pulled out their phones, frantically calling their financial teams to sever any remaining ties with his crumbling firm. The journalists snapped rapid-fire photos of the scattered bank statements, capturing the undeniable evidence of the fake shell companies and the forged vendor invoices. The massive financial fraud was no longer a secret. It was a spectacular televised reality. Desmond stopped struggling against the security guards. The fight completely drained out of his body, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. His eyes darted frantically across the spilled documents near his face. He saw the highlighted bank transfers. He saw the exact dates of the stolen funds. The arrogant, entitled rage that had fueled his attack on his own son completely evaporated. He was no longer a furious man demanding respect. He was a cornered, broken criminal who had just realized that there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. Down in the front row, Sabrina fell to her knees. She was clutching her emerald gown, openly sobbing, as the sheer magnitude of their destruction washed over her. She knew the lavish lifestyle she had built on stolen money was gone forever. There would be no mansion, no luxury cars, and no billionaire inheritance. There was only the crushing reality of total inescapable poverty and the looming shadow of federal prison. Then, a new sound pierced through the heavy silence of the grand ballroom. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing through the city streets, but it grew louder and more insistent with every passing second. It was the sharp, undeniable sound of approaching police sirens. The wailing multiplied as multiple patrol cars and federal transport vehicles converged on the luxury hotel. The sound bled through the thick walls and heavy glass windows of the ballroom, ringing loudly in the ears of my son. Pure, unadulterated panic violently seized him. He started thrashing under the guards again, twisting his shoulders and kicking his legs in a pathetic, desperate attempt to find a way out. He screamed that it was a setup, that the documents were forged, but his voice cracked with raw, pathetic fear. He bucked against the heavy hands holding him down, looking wildly toward the rear exit, desperately trying to escape a steel trap that had already snapped completely shut around him. The wailing sirens outside reached a deafening pitch, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers above us. The heavy brass handles of the main ballroom doors turned, and the massive wooden panels were thrown wide open. The chaotic murmurs of the wealthy elites died instantly, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. A wave of local police officers flooded into the grand hall, fanning out to secure every exit. But they were not the ones leading the charge. Walking ahead of the uniformed officers were 4 men dressed in sharp, immaculate dark gray suits. They moved with a terrifying synchronized purpose, their faces completely devoid of any emotion. Pinned to their belts and hanging from lanyards around their necks were the unmistakable gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I recognized them immediately. They were the exact men I had pointed out to Colton earlier that evening, the men waiting by the service doors. The men who now possessed the silver flash drive containing every single piece of evidence required to bury my son in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Billionaires, philanthropists, and aggressive journalists practically shoved each other out of the way to clear a wide path. The federal agents did not spare a single glance for the cameras or the glittering guests. Their eyes were locked dead ahead, marching in a straight, unwavering line directly toward the stage where Desmond was still pinned to the hardwood floor. Desmond twisted his head, his cheeks smearing against the polished wood, trying to see who was coming. When he saw the gold badges shining under the stage lights, the last remaining ounce of fight evaporated from his body. His shoulders sagged, and a pathetic whimpering sound escaped his throat. He looked past the agents and saw Colton standing near the edge of the stage. The realization hit him like a freight train. He finally understood exactly who Colton had handed that flash drive to. The betrayal he felt in that moment was profound, but it was nothing compared to the absolute devastation he had inflicted on me 15 years ago. The lead agent stepped onto the stage, his polished shoes crunching over the spilled forensic accounting documents Callum had dropped moments before. He signaled to the hotel security guards. The guards stepped back, hauling Desmond up to his knees. The federal agent looked down at my son, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He recited the charges in a loud, booming voice that echoed off the high ceilings. Wire fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud investors of $4 million. Every single word was another massive blow, crushing the fake empire Desmond had built. While the agent read Desmond his rights, my attention was pulled downward by a sudden, desperate movement. Sabrina had been kneeling in the front row, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their public destruction. But as the cold reality of a federal prison materialized right in front of her eyes, her paralysis broke into absolute unhinged terror. She realized the stolen corporate credit cards, the designer gowns, and the luxury cars were all gone. She realized her freedom was expiring in real time. She scrambled forward, her expensive emerald silk dress catching and tearing on the edge of a stray camera tripod. She crawled right to the edge of the stage, tears completely ruining her meticulously applied makeup. Her face was a twisted mask of pure panic. She reached up over the velvet rope and grabbed tightly onto my pant leg. Her hands were shaking violently, her diamond rings catching the harsh stage lights as she dug her fingers into the fabric of my suit. "Dad!" she sobbed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "Dad, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it is a misunderstanding. We can fix this. We can give the money back. Please do not let them take us away. We are family. You have to save us. We are your family." She looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, begging the very man she had mocked and robbed just a few hours prior. She expected the soft, forgiving old grandfather to magically reappear and shield her from the consequences of her own staggering greed. She actually thought the word family still held any weight between us. I looked down at the woman who had helped coordinate my ruin. I looked at the hands that had eagerly packed up my belongings while I was mourning the death of my wife. I felt no anger in that moment. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, pristine clarity of justice. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer a single word of reassurance. I looked her dead in the eye, and with a slow, deliberate motion, I physically pulled my leg back, forcing her trembling hands to slip off my suit. She fell forward slightly, her hands hitting the cold floor of the stage. I looked down at her, crying, pathetic face. I leaned forward just slightly, ensuring my voice was low enough for only her and Desmond to hear, but sharp enough to cut straight through their souls. I looked at the two people who had destroyed my past, and I handed them their future. "You will figure it out," I said. It was the exact phrase they had written on that yellowed note 15 years ago. The exact words they had used to condemn me to a life on the streets. Hearing those words repeated back to her completely broke whatever was left of Sabrina's spirit. She collapsed against the velvet rope, burying her face in her hands, wailing in absolute inescapable despair as the federal agents hauled her husband to his feet and locked the steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around the wrists of my son echoed over the fading wails of the police sirens outside. That tiny mechanical sound seemed to snap the final remaining thread of his sanity. Desmond did not hang his head in defeat. He did not accept his fate with any shred of quiet dignity. Instead, a violent, desperate survival instinct took over his entire body. He twisted his upper torso violently, ignoring the heavy grips of the federal agents holding his arms, and turned his furious, bloodshot eyes directly toward his wife. Sabrina was still slumped against the thick velvet rope, her expensive emerald gown torn and ruined, black mascara streaming down her pale face. Desmond looked at the woman he had partnered with to destroy my life, and without a single second of hesitation, he threw her entirely under the bus. He screamed at the federal agents, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He told them to arrest her immediately. He yelled that he was not the mastermind, that Sabrina was the one who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. He jerked his cuffed hands awkwardly in her direction and shouted that she was the one who forced him to sell my house 15 years ago. He told the stunned crowd of investors and journalists that Sabrina was the one who forged the legal documents and manipulated the power of attorney while I was heavily medicated and grieving my late wife. The sheer, unadulterated betrayal in his voice was spectacular to witness. He was completely willing to sacrifice the mother of his child if it meant shaving even a single month off his impending federal prison sentence. Hearing those accusations, Sabrina stopped crying immediately. Her profound despair instantly mutated into pure venomous rage. The polished, elegant society wife vanished, completely replaced by a cornered, vicious predator. She scrambled up from the hardwood floor, ignoring the torn silk of her dress, and lunged directly toward her husband. A hotel security guard had to step in quickly, grabbing her firmly by the shoulders to keep her from clawing at the face of my son. She screamed right back at him, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged. She told the federal agents not to listen to a single word he said. She yelled that Desmond was a pathological liar, a coward, and a degenerate. She projected her voice over the chaotic murmurs of the ballroom, announcing to every powerful journalist and elite investor present that Desmond had completely destroyed his own real estate firm through his own staggering incompetence. She screamed that he was the one who personally embezzled the $4 million from the private investors. She told the entire room that he did not lose the money in a bad real estate market, but that he had blown every single cent of it on illegal offshore gambling and catastrophic hidden debts. She frantically confessed to the entire crowd that she only went along with the recent credit card fraud because Desmond had bankrupted their family and threatened to leave her with absolutely nothing. The flawless, carefully manufactured facade of their happy, successful marriage was violently ripped to shreds in front of hundreds of flashing camera lenses. It was an absolute bloodbath of mutual destruction. They stood there, under the bright stage lights, viciously tearing each other apart, voluntarily confessing to massive federal crimes, just to ensure the other person went down with them. They were like two drowning rats, stepping on each other's heads, just to grab one more breath of air. The federal agents did not even need to interrogate them. They simply stood back and let the two criminals scream their full confessions into the open air, while the eager journalists recorded every single damning syllable. The microphones picked up every accusation, broadcasting their toxic greed to the entire world. The lead agent finally gave a sharp, definitive nod. Two local police officers stepped forward, and grabbed Sabrina by the arms, roughly pulling her hands behind her back and slapping a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. She kicked and thrashed, her heels slipping on the polished floor, still screaming absolute profanities at her husband. Desmond kept shouting over her, loudly begging the agents to offer him a plea deal, promising to testify against his wife as they physically dragged him backward down the long center aisle of the grand ballroom. The elite guests parted ways immediately. The billionaires, the industry leaders, and the media personnel watched in absolute horrified silence as the two people who had arrived, looking like corporate royalty, were hauled away like rabid animals. The massive wooden doors of the grand hall slammed shut behind them with a heavy final thud, instantly cutting off their frantic, pathetic screaming. The bright flashing lights of the cameras slowly faded. The chaotic, suffocating energy rapidly drained out of the massive room, leaving behind a profound stillness. I stood perfectly still on the center of the stage, looking out over the silent, stunned crowd. I looked down at Callum, my lawyer, who gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. I looked over at Colton, my grandson, who was staring blankly at the closed wooden doors, quietly processing the permanent, irreversible end of his former life. The grand hall was completely quiet. The suffocating storm had finally passed. The brutal war I had waged in total silence was officially over. My empire was entirely secure, and the absolute order of my life had been flawlessly restored. The deafening chaos of the grand ballroom had entirely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. The flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, the federal agents hauling my son away in heavy steel handcuffs. It was all gone. What remained was the glittering debris of a shattered empire, broken champagne flutes, abandoned cocktail napkins, and the scattered, trampled pages of the forensic accounting report littered the expensive hardwood floor. The elite guests had fled the scene as quickly as their luxury town cars could carry them, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the toxic fallout of my family's spectacular public execution. I stood near the edge of the stage, the heavy silence settling over my shoulders, and looked across the vast empty hall. There, huddled in the dark shadows of the grand sweeping staircase, was Colton. My 22-year-old grandson had completely collapsed. He was sitting on the bottom marble step, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried deep in his hands. His shoulders shook with violent, silent sobs. He had just watched federal agents drag his mother and father out of the building to face decades in prison. He had just stood in front of the world and permanently destroyed the only family he had ever known. I knew exactly what was crushing him in that moment. It was not just the trauma of the betrayal. It was the terrifying, suffocating realization of his new reality. An hour ago, he was the privileged heir to a sprawling real estate fortune, a young man who had never had to worry about a single credit card bill or tuition payment. Now he was the son of 2 convicted felons. His last name was permanently stained with the ugly brush of a massive federal fraud scandal. The imaginary trust fund his parents had promised him was completely gone, replaced by a staggering mountain of student loan debt that he was now entirely responsible for. He had absolutely nothing, and he was completely alone. A younger, softer version of myself might have walked over to those stairs and wrapped my arms around him. I might have told him that everything was going to be all right, that I would fix it, that I would write a massive check and make the pain go away. But I had learned the hard way that shielding a young man from the harsh consequences of reality does not protect him. It only corrupts him. That kind of blind, unconditional financial coddling was exactly what had turned his father into a monster. I was not going to make the exact same mistake twice. A few yards away, A hotel janitor had nervously emerged from the service corridor. He was holding a wide, heavy push broom, looking around hesitantly, unsure if he was allowed to start cleaning the crime scene. I walked over to the young worker, reached out, and silently took the heavy wooden broom from his hands. I turned around and walked slowly across the debris-littered floor, the hard soles of my shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood, until I stood directly in front of my grandson. Colton did not look up. He just kept crying, entirely consumed by his own devastating grief. I did not kneel down to his level. I did not offer a gentle, comforting whisper. I held the broom out and simply dropped it. The heavy wooden handle clattered loudly against the marble steps, landing just inches from his expensive leather shoes. Colton flinched, pulling his hands away from his tear-streaked face. He looked down at the broom, then slowly tilted his head up to look at me. His red, swollen eyes filled with absolute confusion. "You did a very brave thing tonight, Colton," I said, my voice perfectly steady, carrying a firm, unyielding authority. "You stood up in front of the world and chose the truth over a comfortable, profitable lie. I respect you for that. But crying on the floor of a luxury hotel is not going to pay off your student loans. It is not going to put food on your table, and it is certainly not going to rebuild your ruined reputation." Colton stared at me, his breath hitching in his throat. He expected me to save him. He expected this billionaire grandfather to pull out a checkbook and magically erase the terrifying uncertainty of his future. I looked him dead in the eye and shattered that expectation immediately. "The illusion of your wealth died tonight," I told him, gesturing to the empty, messy ballroom around us. "Your parents spent their entire lives trying to steal their way to the top because they were fundamentally terrified of hard work. They taught you how to wear an expensive suit, and they taught you how to act like you were better than everyone else, but they never taught you how to actually survive. It is time for you to learn. Pick up the broom, Colton. Start cleaning up this mess. Honest labor will clear your head." The silence between us stretched out heavy and absolute. I watched the internal battle play out across his young, tear-stained face. He looked at the broom, then out at the massive, daunting mess scattered across the ballroom floor. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to refuse. I thought the toxic entitlement his parents had drilled into his skull was going to win out over his desire to change. But then Colton reached up and wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He took a deep, shuddering breath, leaned forward, and wrapped his hands tightly around the rough wooden handle of the broom. He stood up, towering over the debris, and took his very first step forward. It was the absolute hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. And it was the very first lesson in true, unforgiving independence that his parents had never bothered to teach him. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine and fresh soil as a taxi pulled up to the curb. Colton stepped out, looking exhausted, but remarkably clear-headed. He had spent the entire night sweeping the debris from the grand ballroom. That grueling physical labor had stripped away the last remnants of his entitled upbringing. He walked up the short gravel driveway, looking around in quiet disbelief. He was standing in front of my actual home. It was not a sprawling estate or a towering glass penthouse. It was a sturdy, simple wooden house, tucked away in a quiet, unassuming suburb. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the front porch was modest, and the paint was a quiet shade of gray. This was the I had built for myself, far away from the blinding lights and toxic greed of the corporate world. I was sitting on the wooden porch swing, holding a mug of black coffee, watching my grandson approach. Colton climbed the 3 wooden steps and stood before me. He did not look like the arrogant heir his parents had tried to mold him into. He looked like a young man who had just woken up from a very long, very dark nightmare. He kept his eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards for a long moment before looking up at me. His voice was heavy with shame as he apologized. He told me he was deeply sorry for everything his parents had done. He apologized for living comfortably on money that was stolen from me, and he apologized for never questioning the lies he had been fed his entire life. I took a slow sip of my coffee and nodded. I told him that an apology was a good start, but words were ultimately cheap. I explained that true character was built by what a man did after he said he was sorry. Colton swallowed hard, shifting his weight nervously. He told me that his entire life had been completely upended, with his parents facing federal prison and their assets completely frozen by the government. He was left with absolutely nothing. He explained that his university tuition was severely past due, and he was carrying a staggering amount of debt that his father had secretly taken out in his name. His voice trembled slightly as he asked the question I knew was coming. He asked if I could loan him some money. He pleaded for just a small cash loan, just enough to pay off his immediate debts and keep him from getting evicted from his campus apartment. He promised he would pay me back every single penny once he graduated and found a decent job. I did not hesitate. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden table next to the swing. I looked him dead in the eye and told him absolutely not. I stated firmly that I would not give him a single cent in cash. Colton flinched, as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue or to beg, but I raised my hand to stop him before he could utter a single sound. I told him that handing over raw cash was the exact same mistake I had made with his father. I explained that blind financial coddling was a deadly poison. It had turned his father into a lazy, entitled criminal who believed the world owed him a living. I told Colton that I loved him too much to infect him with that exact same disease. I was not going to write a magic check and rob him of the opportunity to learn how to survive on his own. I reached down to the floor beside my swing and picked up a plain manila folder. I held it out to him. Colton took it with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a legally binding contract I had drafted with Callum early that morning. I explained the strict terms very clearly. I told Colton that my foundation would pay his university tuition directly to the school administration. He would not see a single dime of that money in his own bank account. In exchange for this support, he was required to work 20 hours a week as a clerk at the $150 trust. He would be filing paperwork, answering phones, and directly helping the elderly victims his parents had so viciously despised. I told him he would earn a standard hourly wage, and he would use that specific wage to pay for his own rent, his own food, and his own debts. There would be no luxury cars, no designer clothes, and absolutely no free rides. Colton read the document carefully. I watched his face, waiting to see if the toxic pride his mother had instilled in him would suddenly flare up. I waited to see if he would throw the folder down and walk away in anger, feeling insulted by the offer of manual labor, but he did not. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over his tired features. For his entire life, his parents had used money to manipulate him, to buy his loyalty, and to keep him comfortably trapped in their web of lies. This contract was completely different. It was an honest, unforgiving boundary. It was an opportunity to earn his own way in the world. With his head held high, Colton looked up from the paper, his eyes shining with a new, quiet determination. He asked me for a pen. I handed him the silver pen from my shirt pocket. He placed the folder against the wooden porch railing and signed his name at the bottom of the page without a single second of hesitation. The line was definitively drawn, and the foundation for a real family was finally laid. 6 months passed, with the relentless, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing out the chaotic noise of the hungry press waiting on the front marble steps. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity, filled with journalists, former investors, and curious onlookers wanting to witness the final chapter of the city's most infamous family betrayal. I sat in the polished wooden chair of the witness stand, calmly adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. Across the wide aisle, sitting at the stark metal defense table, were Desmond and Sabrina. They did not look like the arrogant corporate royalty who had paraded down the red carpet half a year ago. Their bespoke suits and emerald gowns had been stripped away, replaced by dull, oversized standard-issue prison jumpsuits. Desmond looked completely hollowed out. His posture had collapsed. His skin was pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the imposing room. I looked at him, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a rush of furious anger either. I felt absolutely nothing but the pristine, freezing clarity of a man delivering long overdue consequences. The prosecuting attorney approached the wooden stand and politely asked me to state my name for the official record. I leaned toward the microphone and spoke with a cold, unwavering precision. For the next 2 hours, I answered every single question they threw at me. I detailed the exact timeline of events, tracing the history of their deceit, without shedding a single tear, without my voice trembling, and without showing any sign of emotional weakness. The defense attorney tried to rattle me, attempting to paint me as a vindictive billionaire holding a petty grudge, but my composure was absolute iron. I did not give my son the satisfaction of seeing me break. I laid out the cold, hard facts of his betrayal, letting the sheer brutality of his actions speak completely for themselves. The prosecutor then turned his back to the defense table and walked over to the jury box, signaling the court clerk to turn on the massive evidence projector. He did not just focus on the $4 million embezzlement that had brought the federal agents to the gala. He dug much deeper. He pulled up documents from 15 years ago. The glowing screen behind the judge illuminated the original deed to my old suburban home, right alongside the power of attorney paperwork that had authorized the secret sale. The prosecutor then displayed a verified microscopic forensic analysis of the signatures. The forgery was undeniable. I explained to the silent, breathless courtroom exactly how Desmond had orchestrated the theft. I described how he had slipped those specific pages into a thick stack of hospital bills and insurance forms while I was heavily medicated, completely numb, and actively mourning the death of my late wife. I watched the faces of the 12 jurors as they processed the absolute depravity of his actions. Several of them physically recoiled, their expressions twisting in pure disgust. They saw the calculated predatory forgery from a decade and a half ago, perfectly paired with the brand new bank statements showing his stolen investor funds. The pattern of his staggering greed was laid bare for the entire world to judge. He had been a ruthless thief his entire adult life, stealing first from his grieving father, and finally from the people who had foolishly trusted his business. Desmond sank lower into his chair, unable to look at the screen, unable to look at the jury, and entirely unable to look at me. The trial did not drag on. The paper trail was far too overwhelming. The digital evidence, too incredibly damning to debate. When the jury foreman eventually stood up to read the final decision, the tension in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. Guilty on all charges. The word echoed through the silent courtroom, like a heavy steel vault door slamming shut forever. The federal judge, a stern, unyielding woman with absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals, did not hold back during the official sentencing. She looked directly down from her elevated bench at Desmond and Sabrina, her voice ringing out with sharp, unmistakable disdain. She condemned their actions as a sickening display of profound moral bankruptcy, noting that they had weaponized family trust for selfish financial gain. She raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, echoing crack. She sentenced them both to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. 15 years. It was a perfectly poetic, devastating symmetry. 1 year behind bars, for every single year I had spent rebuilding my life from the absolute ashes they had left me in. Desmond did not cry out. He did not scream or thrash against the baifs like he had at the charity gala. He simply dropped his head, his forehead resting heavily against the cold metal of the defense table. His shoulders slumped as the crushing, agonizing reality finally broke through his thick skull. The terrifying math of his own stupidity was playing out in his mind. He had thrown away a guaranteed inheritance of $1 billion biotechnology empire. He had lost wealth beyond his wildest comprehension, all because he was too impatient and too exceptionally greedy to earn $2 million. Honestly, he had sacrificed his freedom, alienated his only son, and destroyed his entire future for absolute nothing. The heavy silence in the courtroom lingered as the bailiff stepped forward. They grabbed Desmond by the arms and hauled him to his feet, preparing to take him away. He cast one final broken look back at the witness stand, but I was already turning away, perfectly at peace with the justice that had finally been served. The visitor room of the federal penitentiary was a masterpiece of sterile, depressing architecture. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale hue over the rows of scratched plastic chairs and thick, reinforced plexiglass dividers. I sat perfectly still in my designated seat, waiting. I did not feel anxious. My heart rate was as steady as the ticking of a grandfather clock. I was not there to offer forgiveness or to seek closure. I was there to deliver a final definitive period to the end of a very long sentence. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the room buzzed and clicked open. A correctional officer led my son into the visitor area. I watched Desmond walk toward the glass, and for a fleeting second, it was difficult to reconcile the man in front of me with the arrogant, polished real estate mogul from 6 months ago. The bespoke midnight blue tuxedo had been replaced by an oversized, faded khaki jumpsuit. His posture was completely broken. His shoulders slumped inward, and his hair was thinning, unkempt, and graying heavily at the temples. The suffocating reality of a 15-year federal sentence had aged him a decade in just a few short months. He sat down heavily on the metal stool on his side of the glass. He reached out with trembling hands and picked up the black plastic telephone receiver. I mirrored his action, lifting the heavy handset to my ear. For a long moment, the line was completely silent, except for the harsh sound of his erratic breathing. He looked at me through the smudged plexiglass, his eyes red and bloodshot. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you for coming. I did not think you would ever want to see me again." I remained completely silent, letting his words hang in the sterile air between us. The silence forced him to keep talking, to fill the void with the performance he had undoubtedly rehearsed in his cell. He leaned closer to the glass, resting his forehead against the barrier. "I am so sorry," he cried, his voice dripping with a pathetic, desperate sorrow. "I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I lost everything, Dad. I lost my company, my wife, my son. I sit in that cell every single night thinking about what I did to you. I just want you to know how deeply sorry I am." I listened to his apology. It sounded entirely hollow, empty of any genuine remorse. It was the apology of a man who was sorry he got caught, not a man who regretted the pain he had caused. I kept my face an absolute mask of stone, giving him absolutely nothing to work with. When he realized that his tearful performance was not going to break through my armor, he wiped his eyes and shifted his posture. The sorrow vanished, replaced instantly by a familiar creeping urgency. The fundamental parasitic nature of his personality could not be hidden for long. "It is so hard in here, Dad," he continued, his tone shifting smoothly from apologetic to whining. The food is completely inedible. The conditions are terrible. I have absolutely nothing left. They stripped all of my accounts. Colton will not even answer my letters. I am completely alone. He paused, swallowing hard. He looked at me with a desperate, hungry expression. I was wondering, he stammered, if you could just do me one tiny favor. Just a small deposit into my prison commissary account. Just enough so I can buy some decent food and basic supplies. You have billions, Dad. A few hundred would mean absolutely nothing to you, but it would change my entire life in here. There it was, the absolute undeniable truth of who my son was. Even after losing his entire world, even after being sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for massive financial fraud, his very first instinct upon seeing the father he had betrayed was to ask for a handout. The greed was a terminal illness, deeply rooted in his very DNA. I did not yell at him. I did not berate him for his breathtaking audacity. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a small silver money clip. Slowly and deliberately, I slid 2 specific bills out from under the metal clip. I held them up, positioning them just inches from the thick plexiglass so he could see them clearly under the harsh fluorescent lights. 1 crisp $100 bill and 1 crisp $50 bill. Desmond stopped whining. He stared at the money, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He watched as I folded the bills neatly together. I leaned forward and pushed the money through the narrow metal transaction slot positioned at the very bottom of the heavy glass divider. The folded bills slid through to his side, resting quietly on the metal ledge. Desmond looked down at the money. He looked back up at me, his eyes darting frantically, searching my expression for an explanation. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why? Exactly $150. I kept the black plastic receiver pressed tightly to my ear. "Because, Desmond," I replied, my voice absolutely frozen and unwavering, "that is exactly what you left me." I watched the realization physically hit him. I watched his mind snap back 15 years to a cold, empty driveway. He remembered the locks being changed. He remembered packing up his car and driving away. He remembered leaving his grieving father with nothing but a pathetic crumpled wad of cash and a cruel handwritten note telling me to figure it out. The sheer devastating weight of the poetry crushed him entirely. He stared down at the $150 sitting on the metal ledge. The full, horrifying spectrum of his public and private humiliation washed over him in a violent tidal wave. It was not a lifeline. It was a mirror, reflecting his absolute monstrosity, right back at him. Desmond covered his face with his hands and burst into loud, uncontrollable sobs. His tears were not a performance this time. They were tears of profound, inescapable shame. He wept as the crushing reality of his 15-year sentence finally anchored itself to his soul. I did not offer him a final word of comfort. I pulled the heavy plastic receiver away from my ear and set it gently back onto its metal hook, cutting off the sound of his pathetic crying. I stood up from the hard plastic chair. I buttoned my suit jacket, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. I turned around and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors of the visitor center. I did not look back. My posture was perfectly straight, completely unburdened by the ghost of the son I used to know. The final thread tying me to a lifetime of unappreciated sacrifice had been permanently severed forever, cutting off any trace of pity. 2 years flew by, with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life finally lived on my own terms. I found myself sitting in the front row of a massive sunlit university stadium. The morning air was warm and filled with the buzzing electric energy of graduation day. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, resting my hands comfortably on my lap. I was not sitting there as a corporate titan or a billionaire philanthropist. I was simply a grandfather, waiting to see the young man who had successfully rebuilt his entire life from absolute scratch. I watched the sea of students in their black caps and flowing gowns. Colton was seated among them. He looked absolutely nothing like the broken, terrified boy who had collapsed on the marble steps of a luxury hotel 2 years ago. He had completely transformed. He had worked 20 grueling hours a week, filing paperwork at my foundation, while carrying a heavy course load at the university. He had paid for his own rent, bought his own groceries, and learned exactly what it meant to earn his place in the real world. He had not asked me for a single penny in cash since the morning we signed that strict employment contract on my front porch. A heavy, expectant hush fell over the sprawling stadium as the university dean stepped up to the wooden podium to introduce the valedictory speaker. When the dean called the name of Colton, a profound wave of pride washed over my entire body. Colton stood up and walked up the steps to the main stage with a strong, confident posture. He adjusted the tall microphone and looked out over the massive crowd of proud parents and graduating students. He did not talk about his mother or his father. He did not mention the massive public scandal or the federal prison sentences that had completely shattered his past. Instead, he spoke about the heavy, unforgiving weight of reality and the true meaning of absolute independence. Colton gripped the edges of the podium, and his voice rang out clear and unwavering over the massive stadium speakers. He told the thousands of people listening that the greatest lesson he ever learned did not come from a heavy textbook or a prestigious lecture hall. He said it came in the form of a push broom and a crumpled $150. He spoke about how incredibly easy it is to become trapped in the toxic illusion of privilege, and how completely blinding unearned wealth can be. He told the crowd that true survival is not about finding someone who is willing to rescue you when you fall. He said, true survival is about finding the absolute internal strength to stand back up on your own 2 feet when nobody else is coming to save you. Colton paused his speech and looked directly down at the front row, locking his eyes completely with mine. The entire stadium seemed to hold its breath as he delivered his final powerful words. He said the man who saved his life did not do it by writing a magic check or offering a comfortable lie. He said the man who saved him did it by drawing a hard, unforgiving boundary and demanding absolute accountability. He smiled a strong, genuine smile and told the silent crowd that the man who taught him the true value of a hard-earned dollar and the priceless nature of self-respect was his grandfather. The applause that erupted through the stadium was absolutely deafening. I sat in my chair listening to the roaring crowd, feeling an incredible warmth spread through my chest. I did not clap wildly or shout his name, but the immense quiet satisfaction I felt was deeper than any corporate victory I had ever experienced. The boy had finally become a man. After the formal ceremony, the manicured campus lawns transformed into a chaotic sea of celebrating families, posing for pictures, and exchanging joyful hugs. I stood near the edge of the graduation stage, waiting patiently. Colton navigated through the massive crowd, walking straight toward me, with his hard-earned diploma gripped tightly in his right hand. He stopped right in front of me. We did not exchange 1,000 emotional words. We did not need to. We understood each other with a perfect crystal clarity that only comes from mutual absolute respect. A fellow student passing by to take a picture of us. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my grandson, looking toward the camera lens. I did not force a polite camera-ready expression. For the very first time in over 15 years, a real, genuine smile broke across my face. It reached all the way to my eyes. Looking at the young man standing beside me, I realized that the ashes of a deeply toxic family had been completely swept away by the wind. In its place stood a brand new foundation, built entirely on honesty, unyielding boundaries, and a love that was finally truly earned. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of my private study at the very top of the city. The massive mahogany desk was completely clear, except for a single thick leather-bound folder resting perfectly in the center. Callum stood near the heavy wooden doors, holding his familiar briefcase. He did not say a word as I walked over and opened the folder. It was the comprehensive annual impact report for the $150 trust. I ran my hand over the crisp pages, slowly absorbing the sheer magnitude of what we had built together over the last 24 months. The numbers printed on the heavy paper were absolutely staggering. The foundation had fully funded aggressive legal defense teams for over 3,000 elderly individuals across the country. These were vulnerable people who were actively being defrauded, manipulated, and intimidated by their own flesh and blood. I read through the briefcase summaries, detailing how our network of ruthless corporate lawyers had successfully frozen illegal asset transfers and recovered stolen retirement funds. We had fought back against forged powers of attorney and placed hundreds of abusive family members behind bars. I read about a 70-year-old widow who had been locked out of her own home by her daughter. Because of our rapid legal intervention, she was sleeping safely in her own bed tonight, while her daughter awaited federal trial. The small, pathetic sum my son had left me on that kitchen counter had officially blossomed into an unstoppable financial juggernaut of pure, relentless justice. I closed the heavy leather folder, feeling a profound weight lift from my shoulders. I walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The late afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows across the sprawling city skyline, painting the glass towers in brilliant shades of copper and amber. I looked out over the vast grid of streets, feeling an absolute unshakable stillness settled deep inside my chest. For 15 long years I had carried the heavy, suffocating burden of my son's betrayal. I had spent countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering where exactly I went wrong as a father. I used to agonize over how the little boy I raised had mutated into such a cold, calculating monster, willing to leave me to die on the street. But looking down at the city, bathed in the fading sunlight, I finally realized the undeniable truth. The infection was never my fault. Greed is a terminal, insidious disease that some people simply choose to contract. I did not destroy my son or his wife. I did not seek out petty emotional revenge. I simply removed the safety net of my wealth and held up a massive mirror to their absolute moral bankruptcy. I allowed them to suffer the exact devastating consequences they had so eagerly and meticulously prepared for me. The rotten, diseased branches of my family tree had been ruthlessly severed without a single ounce of hesitation. Because of that painful, necessary amputation, the roots of my life were finally able to heal. The billion-all fortune that Desmond had tried so desperately to steal was now acting as an impenetrable shield for thousands of forgotten people who had absolutely nobody else to fight for them. Callum walked over and stood quietly beside me, looking out at the fading golden sunlight. He had been my sharpest weapon and my most loyal confidant through the darkest chapters of this war. He reached into his dark briefcase and pulled out a single pristine sheet of paper, placing it gently on the very edge of my mahogany desk. He looked at me with a deep, professional respect and asked if I had made my final decision regarding the board of directors. He asked if I was finally ready to sign the official corporate documents and step down completely as the active chief executive of my biotechnology empire. I turned away from the towering glass window and looked down at the single dotted line waiting for my signature. I had spent my entire adult life building, accumulating, and fighting to survive in a ruthlessly competitive corporate world. I had cured physical diseases in the laboratory, and I had purged the toxic parasites from my own bloodline. I had secured my legacy, and I had successfully guided my grandson toward an honest, independent future. There were absolutely no more battles left for me to fight, and no more massive empires left for me to build. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit, pulled out my silver pen, and pressed the ink firmly against the heavy paper. I signed my name with a smooth, unbroken stroke, feeling a quiet, profound sense of closure wash over the entire room. I placed the silver pen back into my pocket and turned to look at Callum. I told him that the paperwork was officially done and the transition of power was complete. I buttoned my suit jacket, looking out at the horizon one last time. I told him that I had spent the last 74 years surviving, working, and fiercely protecting my legacy from thieves in expensive suits. I smiled a calm, genuine smile and told him that now it was time for me to finally truly live. The gentle, rhythmic clicking of my fishing reel was the only sound breaking the perfect stillness of the late afternoon. I sat in a weathered wooden chair on the edge of a quiet, secluded lake, miles away from the towering glass skyscrapers and the relentless noise of the city. The setting sun cast a long, warm copper glow across the surface of the water, reflecting off the gentle ripples and illuminating my face. I could feel the deep lines and heavy wrinkles around my eyes, but for the first time in a decade and a half, they were not carved by chronic stress or suffocating grief. They were settled in absolute profound peace. My smartphone rested on the wooden dock beside my tackle box, completely dark and entirely silent. There were no more frantic buzzing notifications. There were no more panicked voicemails from a son begging for a $2 million lifeline to save himself from federal prison. There were no more pathetic manufactured lies wrapped in the sickening disguise of familial love. The toxic, deafening noise that had violently interrupted my life had been permanently and ruthlessly silenced. The air out here was crisp and incredibly clean, completely untainted by the desperate greed of a man who had viewed his own father as an expiring bank account. I cast my line out into the deep water, watching the small red bobber settle gently on the glassy surface. I took a slow, deep breath and thought about the staggering, unimaginable distance between the man I was and the man I am today. 15 years ago, I was a discarded, broken shell of a human being, standing on a cold, concrete driveway. I was a grieving widower who had just been thrown out like a bag of worthless garbage, expected to simply fade away and die quietly in the shadows. My son and his wife thought my silence was absolute submission. They confused my crushing heartbreak for terminal weakness. They forgot one fundamental, undeniable truth about the man who raised them. I do not lay down and surrender. I did not just survive the cruel, twisted game they forced me into. I completely dismantled it. I bought the board. I changed the pieces, and I rewrote every single rule of their pathetic, parasitic existence. I took the absolute worst betrayal a parent could ever suffer and weaponized it into an impenetrable financial shield for thousands of forgotten people. I did not seek a loud, violent revenge. I simply held up a massive mirror and allowed their own staggering greed to swallow them completely whole. My grandson Colton is currently sitting at a modest metal desk downtown, earning an honest, standard hourly wage. He is paying his own monthly rent, balancing his own budget, and building a future based entirely on genuine hard work. He visits me on the weekends, not to ask for a cash allowance, but to sit on this very dock and talk to me about his college classes, his daily struggles, and his authentic victories. He successfully broke the generational curse of entitlement. And he did it because I absolutely refused to hand him an easy, unearned salvation. I lost a son to the terminal poison of greed, but I managed to save my grandson by offering him the harsh, unforgiving cure of reality. I reeled my line in slowly, feeling the satisfying mechanical resistance of the gears. Far away from this peaceful lake, in the bustling heart of the financial district, stands the grand marble lobby of my foundation. Thousands of people walk through those heavy glass doors every single day, seeking immediate refuge from the exact same financial abuse I suffered. They arrive broken and terrified, and they leave protected by an army of ruthless corporate lawyers. Right in the absolute center of that massive lobby, resting on a polished black granite pedestal, is a small reinforced glass display case. Inside that perfectly illuminated case rests a crumpled $100 bill, a single $50 bill, and a faded yellow piece of paper. The harsh, hurried handwriting is still perfectly legible. You will figure it out. That piece of paper does not sit hidden away in my private study anymore. It belongs to the public now. It serves as a permanent immortal monument to every greedy, entitled child who mistakenly believes they can rob the parents who gave them life and simply walk away without consequence. It stands as a silent guardian for the elderly, reminding them that they do not have to accept abuse from the people who share their bloodline. I looked out over this quiet lake as the sun finally dipped below the dark green tree sign, casting the sky in brilliant shades of violet and deep blue. A cool evening breeze brushed past my face, carrying the scent of pine and absolute freedom. I leaned back in my wooden chair, completely unburdened by the ghosts of my past. Let that small piece of yellow paper serve as a final definitive warning to anyone who mistakes a quiet old man for an easy target. The silence of a betrayed father or a discarded grandfather is never a sign of defeat. It is never an admission of weakness or an acceptance of a cruel fate. It is simply the deep, heavy calm before the absolute storm. It is the quiet, meticulous preparation before the natural order is restored, once and for all. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that blood does not grant someone a permanent past to disrespect or manipulate you. Family should be a foundation of support, not a breeding ground for entitlement and toxic betrayal. When people show you their true colors by discarding you at your lowest point, you must have the absolute courage to believe them. Rebuilding your life requires severing the ties that bind you to parasites. True wealth is not measured by the money in your bank account, but by the undeniable peace you achieve when you finally stop allowing ungrateful people to drain your spirit. If you agree that respect must be earned, share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe for more stories.